I was initially doing a theology and philosophy degree, and during that I came into contact with psychology, and I was getting quite fed up with some parts of philosophy because it seemed to be a lot of, I liked something more that had an application, so I liked the thoughts of philosophy and sort of certainly the moral sides of it, how to apply it to social issues. But I didn't quite know what to do with it, and then I did an upgrade to psychology. And during that time I'd heard about clinical and counselling, but I'd already decided I wanted to be into adult mental health and be as trained as a therapist as much as possible. And to me that was counselling psychology at the time. So that's why I went into, it was always counselling psychology more than clinical, because I know at the time, it's the attraction of clinical that was funded. But that was why it was counselling, because it was the very adult focus, but lots of different kinds of therapy models to be trained in. That's a difficult one, because I guess what my role as a counselling psychologist is pretty much defined by the NHS, which is now far less interested in the different divisions of psychology. So it's more that I provide therapy individually and as a group when I can, but I'm in a management and leadership role as well, so I have to manage, supervise members of the team, get involved with all sorts of gradations of useful and unuseful local politics, service development, that kind of stuff, and help to shape the service locally and throughout Devon. I'm adults secondary care, what's also called Step 4, so it's the more severe and complex, and particularly people with various diagnoses of personality disorder, psychosis, just complex, multiple, comorbid presentations. Well, I think it's quite an evolving role. Certainly my feeling of when I joined it, so I was invited 2 years ago, and a lot of people have done some really interesting things before that. I suppose I felt that what we needed was to I think it was in line with the idea of the division at the time, was to sort of solidify it. So it's like a 3-year plan in my head, which I'm putting forward to the division as well. That the first was to sort of gather up something, which has become the research hub, but it was initially an idea of a research digest. So we could get a sort of outward-facing block of research that people within the division could contribute to, and that we could begin to sort of talk about how we are a really research interested and savvy group of professionals, and what we are interested in can be interested to the media and the public as well. So the first part of that was to think about developing that, which is really pleased, and thanks to people like Naya, we've developed this research hub now, and that's something that I'm really keen to develop and hand over. The next stage is then to sort of try and encourage our division to fund some substantial funding, to really encourage members to say, okay, I can do this, let's try and do something interesting that's particularly clinically focused, that's practice-based. So I think it'd be quite good if we can get our division to fund something significant to do that, and that's an on-running thing. With the idea behind that as well is not just to get research out there, but to build up networks within counselling psychology, to destroy some of the myths about research that I know, ethics in the NHS, for example, is always a bit of, we're not going to get anywhere, but if we have a big enough group of people behind it, we can, and it's actually not as bad as you think in some trusts. And the third stage really is so in my head anyway, the first stage is to get the research hub and get that up and running, then get this grant hopefully ongoing, and the third stage really is to hand that over to somebody else and see where that takes us. And hopefully that research hub and that's the research we generate can influence the conference and get us known as really good sort of social scientists. I think we're a profession, we probably got into psychology and psychological therapies because we're interested in questions, and those questions can be very amenable to research. And I think we're interested to know, am I any good? Is what I'm doing useful? Or what do we do about that? How do I know more about that? And those questions are really important, but sometimes I think the way that research is spoken about can be off-putting. It becomes austere, it's got to be RCTs, it's got to be this, and people feel they can't contribute enough. And I'm not quite sure that's needed. I think we can have that kind of voice to do it. So actually, I suppose I think that research, I'm terrible at stats, but I love having a number sometimes. And if we're doing something, someone who's good at stats can help me do that. But there's also different kinds of methodologies, and I think people are interested now more or less in just stats. They can see sometimes how stats can be misrepresented, and if it's backed up with something qualitative, it's really quite useful. So I think research is so important because it's It's what we probably got into this career for, and why is that person? Why are you feeling the way you are? Or what can we do to help? And research tools can help us find something out about that, as well as evaluate what we're up to. I think initially it was probably historical. I've been in the NHS now for 17 years, and I think there's an historical suspicion or uncertainty about what counselling psychology was. But quickly people don't really care, the clients don't really care if you're clinical counselling, a therapist, Dave down the pub, as long as you're sort of professional and safe. They weren't as worried, so people would call me their counsellor or their therapist or their psychologist or even their psychiatrist. So I suppose initially there was a bit about that, and some of the interests I've been in, such as neuropsychology. Some people initially in counselling psychology weren't sure about that, and some people in clinical weren't sure as well. I suppose the main thing has been really trying, and it's something I'm struggling with right at the moment, of how I stay, if I do stay in the NHS, in an authentic way. I don't want to repeat all the arguments of the past of anti-diagnosis. I think that's out there. People know about that. It's about how to hold the person of the person when the demand is for ways of people thinking about evidence-based practice and the way services are commissioned, and I think that's as much economic and political as anything else. So I think that's my current challenge, of how to remain authentic, but that might be a lifelong thing. Initially within counselling psychology, I think some people were worried that this was a way of reducing people to sort of formalise numbers and stats, and that by employing tests we were somehow medicalising our processes and medicalising people. And I think when I initially started, when I was an assistant, I had that sort of feeling as well, that, well, we shouldn't be doing that. And I was very fortunate that when I was an assistant, there was a neuropsychologist and clinical psychologist who said, yeah, why don't you just try and do a few of these tests and see what you think. And he taught me from the beginning of how a test is actually a very phenomenological thing. Even doing a WACE, that the least interesting thing was the IQ. The most interesting thing was how that person was on the different subtests. And then when you start to look at the different subtests, you start to get an idea of that person. Like, for example, I'm dyslexic, and when I'm measured on a WACE, I have very different kinds of... But if you just take a number, that's not really going to describe things. And also, dyslexia is quite a wide continuum. So the more you try and understand how that person is, the better it is. So for me, neuropsychology, and I think neuropsychologists I've worked with and researched will say the same thing, that the tests are the least important. They're helpful tools, but it's how you use them always. So what we're always trying to do is build up a phenomenological picture of that individual and what it means to be that person. The numbers can be useful because they talk about, according to this kind of standardization in Western societies, you're like this, but we don't have to hold too tightly to that. The relief with clients that I've worked with, when you actually take their memory problems seriously, because it's often been dismissed as it's just depression, or, oh, well, it's your age. Actually, it isn't. It may not be. And there might be something really significant that you can help identify that's nothing to do with mental health. Or maybe it is to do with mental health and that satisfies. Or it is alongside as well as, but you can help them. And I think to dismiss that is difficult, because I think as counselling psychologists, we're particularly interested in embodiment and being part of the body, incorporating not just the head and this sort of old-fashioned Cartesian dualism where we're integrated. And to sort of ignore this pulp in the middle of our skulls seems a bit strange, because it's such an important part of us. I think the third wave of CBT, even that's thinking more about the body and incorporating stuff, sensory motor and trauma. Why, of course, we're acknowledging the importance of the body, so why ignore the brain, would be my thought about that. From outside of counselling psychology, I think currently it's got more political. We've tried very, very hard to be allowed to do the courses. I love neuropsychology. I'm not a neuropsychologist, I wouldn't even pretend to be, and I think the courses would terrify me. They're really intense. However, we should be given the choice, like any other division of psychology, to do it. I'm not quite sure why that was. I think there's legitimate concerns initially because our courses weren't good at doing any form of neuropsychology. So the initial concerns of your trainees haven't got the basics, I think is fair enough at the time. A lot of those have changed, and at the moment I do a day a week at UWE in Bristol, and there's a lot more neuropsychology being taught there as well. So the initial thoughts, absolutely, we needed to be robust and improve our training. However, people like me, grandfathers, did things through clinical experience, and that needed to be acknowledged as well. So I guess I wonder now if part of the concern is that we're in a very shifting political world. America and Brexit notwithstanding, we're in a very sort of therapeutic shifting world, and people get a bit scared and a bit worried. And I guess maybe if you can say, I can do this, so I should keep my job, there's a sort of very understandable reason why people do it. But I don't think that's good enough. I think we all need to have a fair share of training in what we want to do. So the chapter in the Handbook of Counselling Psychology on neuropsychology, that came about with Barbara asking me to do that quite at the last minute. And I think that was because for a long period of time I've been ranting about neuropsychology and published some stuff on it, and also just ranting with some other people like Sylvia and doing some presentations of saying, you know, I think this is really interesting and I think we should be involved. I don't want to be cultish about it. I want people to have the choice to be involved or not, but I sort of still can't see why you wouldn't want to have some bit of neuro knowledge to fall back on, but I want people to have that option. So I suppose I was asked to do it because apart from the last couple of years, and I've been doing more management, I've always done neuropsychology, and I've been very, very lucky to have neuropsychs supervising me, which is quite unusual because there still aren't that many of them. And how it came about really was, I think, asking me to rant in a slightly more professional way about it. And what I thought would be more useful, as opposed to necessarily trotting out tests, was to suggest this opinion and then talk to some neuropsychs that I knew and ask them to contribute. So that's what I did, and I spoke to a whole bunch of them. And I think it was quite positive because they wanted to, and their outcome was they're not anti-counselling psychology at all. I think they're more anti the idea of being test bashers and the idea that they're some sort of mechanical sort of people who sit in a room and just put people through WACEs or R-bands. So they were very, very accommodating and very, very welcoming in the clinical practice. So these are practitioners. And what they were talking about, the kind of work that they did, a lot of psychodynamics, a lot of CBT, a lot of systemic therapy, and adapting it to the illnesses and neurological conditions that people have, which was like health psychology, which is a lot of work that counselling psychologists do. And I think to sort of stand back and say, I'm a this and you can't do any of it, misses the expertise, because we can do these tests, but trust me, I've done the tests for a very long period of time. You get a good knowledge of it, but there's something a bit different from somebody who's really, really experienced and sort of knows what to look for, knows how to formulate that way. And that's really quite a useful way of using our colleagues. And I think that's what they were saying as well, really. You know, absolutely have a go. And actually, please don't go on about tests all the time. The most important thing is to develop a relationship, and from a neuropsychological perspective, get a really good history. And actually, sometimes that's all you need to do, and maybe a test. And if we can do that, that helps the client immeasurably. It helps the neuropsych if you refer on, or the neurologist. It's just really useful. I've got a passion for secondary mental health care. I've been in the NHS for 17 years doing that. And of course, it's not exclusive to counselling psychology, but I think it's somewhere where we can really make a big difference, a huge difference. And I felt in the past that we've been put off it, perhaps a little bit. Maybe it's been harder to get placements, but also people worry about words like psychosis or personality disorder, and as they should worry about the words, but it's put them off applying. And I can just tell you that from every trainee that I've had as a counselling psychologist, or my colleagues who are clinical counselling have had, they show their value instantly, because what a counselling psychologist comes in and does is, right, I've got to get my practice hours, but I'm really interested in this as well. Give me these people from the waiting list. And they'll go with it. So, you know, if you get somebody's notes or someone's referral, it still scares me to this day when you see this pile of diagnosis and problems and disorders and abuse and all sorts of stuff. But actually, when you get down to it, then you start to make the relationship with the person. And I think counselling psychologists are very good at doing that. And I think we're less afraid of those kind of worries, which is something we should exploit. This isn't to say that other therapists can't do it, but that this is to say we can do it very well. So I think I was asked to do this really because it's something I've published and presented on quite a few times. I think it's to do that and sort of say, look, consider this counselling psychologist, consider this as a career, even part-time or alongside something else. It's difficult because it's been I think like for most of us, it's been a very long road. So I didn't start in psychology. I was doing philosophy and theology, and then did a conversion degree, and then did a master's, and then did the BPS independent route, and then did a doctorate. And through most of that time, obviously I've been working. And we're used to having to fund our own training, so that has an impact on moving around the country, has an impact on keeping contact with friends, lots of different kinds of things. But that's a choice that was made. How that's helped me, I think, and I think how it helps other people, and I certainly ask counselling psychologists to say this in interviews when I'm with them, is that it helps in terms of a robustness. I think that there's a lot of people who are, have got families I haven't, who are training, are doing different jobs, and doing a doctorate training course or doing whatever, and that takes fortitude, it takes resilience. And a lot of that training is by yourself. I think if you're on a course, I wasn't, but if you're on a course, you've got some support. But then again, it's still not as supportive, say, as a clinical psychology doctorate in many ways, because that you're paid to be there at a clinical psychology doctorate, and there's expectations of you, where counselling psychology sometimes is less routine, I think. So I think that's it. I think that has helped in terms of a sense of resilience, a sense of I've been to different parts of the country, you've seen different kinds of communities and seen different ways of practices. So I think the difference and the similarities helps. And a lot of it's serendipity. I think if you're in the right place at the right time, you've got an opportunity that may or may not be there. Some of it's slightly fraudulent. I was thinking about these chapters in the sense that it's easier for me to write a chapter about secondary mental health care if I'm doing it every day. But the discipline of counselling psychology has helped a lot. I think the other part of the training is really understanding what's meant by formulation. That's now become quite a catchword for lots of people, particularly in clinical psychology. But we've always done it, we just haven't been very good at labelling it. So I think those kind of experiences, having the phenomenological, person-centred, sort of sitting back, slightly deconstructed way that counselling psychology is, helps to sit along chaos and uncomfortableness. So in the sort of my managerial lead, it's chaos all the time. The NHS is something that people change all the time. It's always being reorganised, always being cut back. People make some quite mad decisions, and you've got to implement them in a way that sort of works but doesn't work. And you lose a lot of, you could start something and it goes the very next day. And that's very, very demoralising. I'm not saying I've got a solution to that, but I think there's something about the robustness of the absurd and the sort of, resilience that says, keep pushing, maybe something will happen, that helps. And that's quite a convoluted way of saying, I think that's how I've used some of the training experiences. I think it's a good example of what I was wondering about research and applying philosophy and counselling psychology. My colleague, Dr. Francis Gillies, who's a good friend of mine, we both did it together. We sat at that time we were in North Devon with a massive waiting list, absolutely overwhelmed with people. And we thought, right, we know, because she's a counselling psychologist as well, we sort of know these kind of things seem to work in individual practice. And it's more about relationship building, sort of, not necessarily theoretical, but how you make attachment in personality disorders slightly more applicable. How, heart-head lag that comes from MBT. So we sat together and we thought, what the hell are we going to do? At that point I was leading adult mental health, and Francis was there as well. What are we going to do? We can just carry on doing the same, or we can try something different. So she and I sat and we identified a group of people who were constantly going round and round. Sounds un-PC, but they were called the Bring Out Your Dead group, in the sense of these were the people that would always be admitted, that would be discharged or couldn't be discharged, and always going round and round. Something wasn't touching them. And often they would have diagnoses of various different personality disorders, lots of abuse. So with APT, the Adaptation Based Process Therapy, we thought we need to do something as a group, not just because it's cost effective, but actually there was something about a group of people being together that we need to use. Now we wanted some techniques, but the process bit is the fact that of how you be with each other, how these sort of techniques and theories actually come to life. Because what we feel is that people who have lots of complex difficulties are very good at saying, I know what to do, I know what it is, but I can't feel it. So cognitive therapy, for example, which I've got absolutely nothing against at all, it's a really useful therapy, wasn't touching them because it was teaching them stuff they knew and frustrating them, and sometimes the clinician, and sometimes negatively they were saying that they couldn't engage in treatment or they were being difficult. Because actually there was a problem with a feeling, and our belief about that was because of their life experiences, they'd adapted a way of surviving and coping. I don't think there's anything necessarily radical in that. I mean, you could find that traces of that in lots of attachment, psychodynamic and even DBT. But the nature of adaptation was really important to us. So I couldn't help but drop in some of the brain stuff, which is developing. But what we really thought was, what do we do with these people individually that's helpful? And that was things like TA even. The finding a model of talking about the inner child that's tenable, that isn't full of psychobabble, that we can put some diagrams up. So we developed these posters. And I suppose what's unique to APT is that we came up with two things, which is the group. One is the sort of APT, which is the approach. One is an APT star, which has got dimensions of things like flexibility and curiosity. And how somebody you could be on these different kinds of dimensions and ways of experiencing the world all the time, and even just shifting by coming to the group in the first thing is showing a small shift. So if you've got that small shift, right, how does that feel? Talk to me about your body right now. Be with it. And the other part was talking about a lift to describe that emotional dysregulation that we have a poster whereby the guy in a lift, a person in a lift, and lots of different floors. And what happens is it feels that because of various different things that are out of your control, how you've adapted to living, you can shoot up and down between these floors, and you get off on the floor, and sometimes these floors can take you to self-harm and suicide and suicidal thoughts and other kinds of things. Sometimes they take you different places, and actually on these floors there are other people and they push your buttons in the lift. So we're getting an interpersonal thing that, you find yourself in relationships and suddenly, where am I? Why am I on the bridge with a knife? But you haven't got the time to think where that had come from. So APT was all about identifying, normalising and slowing down. So we'd use things like mindfulness as a way of saying, you're in the lift, stop. We used a poster called a traffic lights, which is green for stop, amber for stop and wonder. Just the act of wondering and stopping can sometimes not get you to the floor, take you to a different floor, go to the same floor, not all the way along. And each time you do something different, it moves you along a star, we can talk about change. And in the group we can stop, and with everybody else's minds as well, notice there was a difference, and what did that feel like? And the stop was really, the red, was about stopping and making choices. So it was really quite a fun group, but really heavy going. I mean, there was an occasion people were self-harming in the group. But we had to use that in terms of the approach. Okay, what's happening? Here's what's going to happen because you've done that. But before the ambulance comes, we've got this experience. What are we going to do about it? And that was actually quite useful. And the person came back and hasn't been self-harming. So I would say it's very easy to call it a model, but I think it's more of an approach in the sense that it's just a way of integrating some really good common sense theories and making it applicable to people. We did it in 10 sessions and the outcome measures were pretty good. We used the Millen, for example, which is a measure of personality disorder. And it's quite interesting that you would change, just in maybe 12 weeks, people's diagnosis on that. They'd stop being borderline and maybe become nothing or become schizotypal or vice versa. And that's interesting if you can change the dimensions of a personality. It says something about the construct, but also what's shifted. So you've become less impulsive, but actually you've become more sort of uncertain of who you are. What do we do about that? So the group wasn't a panacea. Not everyone liked it. A vast majority of people did, and it necessarily wasn't a treatment in itself all the time, although 40-50% for people it was, which is pretty good. I don't have as much chance to do it now, which is an irony, because I'm doing too much management. I was doing it while I was, and also Frances stopped and she moved jobs. And I kept on refining it with other members of staff and other professionals. And that was useful as well because other people got it. Because it's very, very practical and you have to go there. So the group is all about being with those feelings, not shutting down self-harm or suicidal thought or depression, but just noticing and being with it and monitoring over the course of an hour and a half, actually that mood has changed. So if that mood has changed in an hour and a half, we can say to that person, here's an experience of change. How do you feel it? And then we can answer that question, the heart-head lag. They get a different kind of experience that isn't about intellectual, it's about experiential. So with regard to the award in 2014, it's a deeply flattering thing to be presented with. That was on the basis of, I think it was, what that is a recognition of lots of people like me who are practitioners, who want to sort of try and expound practice and talk about practice-based evidence and what we can be doing that's different. And a lot of that was driven from being pissed off and fed up and feeling powerless, and thinking, what can I do that's positive about that? So I think things that were included in that were the APT group, which I developed with Francis, and an OCD group that I developed for a long time with a CPN. And that OCD group was really interesting because, again, I sat in North Devon and thinking, we've got suddenly a huge number of people with OCD. A lot of those people had been through various different treatments, including inpatient and the Maudsley, and it wasn't shifting. So part of it was necessity of what we're going to do, and the idea that, and at that time, not many people were doing OCD groups because it was thought that might be a bit tricky, having lots of people with OCD. Oh my God, they're all going to give each other OCD, and of course I had that worry. And the OCD group was, I'll say a little bit about that because it was interesting. I think we're one of the first groups to incorporate mindfulness and how we understood mindfulness in the terms of OCD. So it was based along CBT kind of principles. So each step was like how to challenge thoughts. ERPs are very important with that kind of stuff. However, different ways of getting there, and very much the group process. And as the group went on, it was really successful. The outcome measures are really successful, but it kept on being attended. The one thing with OCD people, if they turn up, they'll turn up. But we have people there, who couldn't leave the house without washing their hands 40 times, making sure they got there on time, which is an enormous change. Why I liked it as well is I did it alongside a CPN, and she was great because she would simply say, "Doesn't make any sense to me. It's not going to make any sense to them. What are you rambling on about? What's this inner self? What do you want about?" So she helped challenge psychobabble and make it more useful. And we also brought the social element into it because she was interested in rehab. So as the group went on, we brought back previous clients from experience to say, look, come on guys, I was this bad and I got here, you can do it, which is enormously powerful. And then we got a support worker involved, and after work we set up a group, out of hours group, which is just like a sort of support group, which we started with them, and then initially they took it over, and then occasionally invite us around bowling or whatever. And it's wonderful if you see people bowling, drinking. Sometimes they're struggling, and sometimes, no, you can do it, and they're just helping each other, and it just normalises so much, because OCD is this horrible, horrible thing that people don't talk about, and it is so debilitating. And of course it wasn't just OCD, there's lots of other things as well, but that was wonderful, and it got stopped for a while. I moved areas, and then people's jobs were changed. It started up again, and it was a good model, I think, of how psychology can be, because although I did it for a long time with the CPN, then I handed it over and just did supervision. So she did it with a support worker, then somebody else did that, and it was just a really helpful way of doing it.